Peritome and acrobustia, a correction. So long as we retain the humility to keep constantly in mind that not one of us is infallible, not even the youngest, as the wit once put it, our mistakes may easily do more good than harm, for their disclosure will always point us to unrealized truths. On page 16 and 17 of the differentiator for February 1953, I discussed the use of the term the circumcision as a supposed synonym for Israel. I do not think that my case will prove easy to refute, but correspondence with my colleague, Mr. Alexander Thompson, has indicated that some modification is called for. I realized at the time that the crucial passage might prove to be Galatians 2, 6 through 9. It seemed to me quite clear then, and so I postponed discussing it till it came up naturally in my series on the Greek Scriptures. See April 1953, page 62. This consideration was given in the June 1953 issue, pages 103 to 106, and two of the points made have now been shown to be erroneous. First, there is a translation error, top of page 104. I ought to have noticed that the Greek word for operates contains the word in, en, meaning in, and would naturally be followed by the dative case. So will readers please correct as quote as to unquote in lines 1 and 2 to quote in unquote. It is not a big matter, but we cannot be too accurate. The most important point comes on page 105. Mr. Thompson insisted here 10 peritomein would be read by any Greek as meaning a people or a company of people. His knowledge of Greek is so vastly greater than mine that I cannot attempt to dispute the point. I must gratefully accept the ruling that here the circumcision is figuratively used to mean the people who have the circumcision, or if we keep to the Greek word as before, the people who have the peritome. But we must not jump to the conclusion that this is necessarily the case elsewhere, for a figurative usage is always a secondary one, or that the expression here means Israel, just Israel without any qualification. What I have said as to that still stands. For the question at once arises, were Israel then and are they now a people who have the peritome? Will readers please turn back to page 57-59 of the April 1953 issue, when they will see that people who have the peritome must mean people who put law into practice and not merely bear the physical sign of covenant privilege. How can we possibly declare that the bulk of Israel then and now, namely those of Israel who have transgressed the law and whose peritome has become acrobustia, are entitled to be called the people who have the peritome? Obviously, we cannot. From this arises another point which I discussed but not quite adequately on pages 104, 105 above mentioned. We must now take it that the division in Galatians 2:9 was between unto the Gentiles and unto the people who have the peritome. The former then was essentially the sphere of Paul, the latter the sphere of Peter. But as matter of historical fact, Paul ministered to Jews as well as Gentiles, to the Jew first. Peter unlocked the kingdom to Gentiles as well as Jews, Acts 2 and 10. The problem thus presented is far easier to solve than appears at first glance. We are here dealing with a subject strictly within the context of this epistle, Galatians. Paul had the kingdom keys commission to unlock the kingdom. This was completed before the meeting in Jerusalem, here recorded, and apart from matters arising out of it, Acts has no more to say about Peter. His contacts with the Gentiles were, so far as the Acts history relates, strictly limited to this theme. So, when 17 years after Paul's return to Damascus from Arabia, he visited Jerusalem a second time as recorded in Galatians, the subject under discussion was Paul's evangel. The evangel which I am heralding among the Gentiles, to use his own words. It was this which became the dominating theme here, Galatians 2:2, Also verse 5, 7, and 14. And the governing question was, what was to be by agreement? Paul's attitude to it, the answer is in the last part of Galatians 2:9. Paul and the apostles with him were to be for the Gentiles, James, Cephas, and John for the people who have the peritome. These three representatives of the 12 here recognize finally two things: the validity of the evangel, which Paul was heralding among the Gentiles, and the fact that their own ministry was for the people who have the peritome. 4 times in Galatians chapter 2 is the evangel entrusted to Paul referred to, yet not once specifically is that entrusted to Peter, but only by implication. In Paul's words, perceiving that I have accepted in trust the evangel of the acrobustia, according as Peter of the peritome. Paul simply went out of the way to say as little as he could about Paul's evangel. He does not even call him Peter except this once, but sticks to Peter's old Hebrew name Cephas and reminds him that he is all along a Jew. That's in 2:14. It is truly remarkable how the one reference to him as Peter is where his evangel is referred to. Is it going too far to deduce that we ought to regard the evangel of Peter as something to be thought of apart from the ministry of Cephas under consideration in the rest of this chapter? The part where Paul sums up the agreement is written in what is, for him, unusually obscure language. No doubt he felt embarrassed at having to discuss the ministry of the 12, and particularly that of Cephas, whom presently he is forced to disclose that he had to reprove. Indeed, he slides away from the words of this reproof into a general exhortation which sums up in a wonderfully concise way the main teaching of Romans. With his instinctive good taste, he spoke about the sphere allotted to Cephas and the rest of the 12 as little as he possibly could. From our point of view, he could say too little, but in fact, Peter's commission unto the peritome is none of our business, and we have no right to complain if that aspect seems obscure to us. What concerns us is the agreement that each side should have clearly defined separate spheres. The whole matter is somewhat hard to clarify, but that should not trouble us if we school ourselves to leave peritome, covenant in the millennial kingdom, to the people to whom they belong, the people who have the peritome. The truth of the matter is that Peter's evangel is not the subject under discussion at all. It comes in only to emphasize this fact and that it was something altogether separate from Paul's. I still contend that Galatians 2:9 has no bearing on the question of whether and when the evangel of the peritome was or is to be proclaimed. Far from weakening my case as I thought at first, I believe that this correction actually confirms it. The chief members of the 12 were to concern themselves with the people who have the peritome. No wonder the 12 thereafter vanished from view, for Paul's evangel made the continued existence of such people the anachronism which it still continues to be. The Christian Jew who imagines he can follow Paul and still keep his peritome is a contradiction in terms. That someday there will again be people who have the peritome and that they will be God's elect is a most important truth. Their God, the extant writings of James, Cephas, and John will lead to the proclamation of the evangel of the peritome to all Israel.